Hello, everyone. This is, I mean, you're not here to enjoy yourselves, and this is going to be a lecture with some quotations. That's why I've got this little sort of stand here. To me, the strange thing about the word about the idea of the stranger, is how easily we forget its necessary connection with the word strange. If you like, it's become estranged from any notion of strangeness. Possibly this is because the stranger has become such a familiar, entirely unstrange staple of our culture. You know, the stranger rides or drives into town, and we can tell right away that he's a stranger. In fact, he's instantly recognizable as such. Encoded in strangeness up to his eyeballs, he's very often played by an actor whose face is known to millions. The expression, "don't be a stranger," is sort of oxymoronic in that it asks someone not to be that which, by virtue of the phrase, means that he or she is anything but. It's also a very intimate, almost flirtatious form of parting. Moving over to music, just in case we don't get the point first time around, the final lines of Leonard Cohen's lovely, beautiful Stranger song, "I told you when I came I was a stranger," they're repeated 4 times at the end, just to make sure that that idea of strangeness is thoroughly embossed on the known. It was very funny and quite telling in London in the 1980s when there were 2 strangers, that's is, not ers, who became impresarios or hosts of London nightclubs. There was Steve Strange, who ran Blitz, and Richard Strange over at Cabaret Futura. So the idea of the strange became doubly familiar to everyone who was part of the sort of underground scene as they vied with each other for that thing which is, of course, the opposite of strangeness, that is to say, familiarity and acclaim. They were out to try to get hold of everything that would sort of de-strange them. I wonder what happened when they bumped into each other as, I don't want to give anything away from the quiz, but when they bumped into each other as strangers on a train. A quick-witted audience. Albert Camus' L'Étranger was first translated into English as The Outsider. That's how I came to know it. But then in the 1980s, it was translated into sort of American English as The Stranger. And I must say, when I was in Algeria, I was on a sort of, I was so crazy about Camus, and I was on a journey which the editors of Esquire, who I was writing for, they predictably enough called it, they said I was on an existential journey. Anyway, when I checked into a little pensione with virtually nobody there except this little boy, I got a great sort of charge of excitement, of recognition when he called out, "Mama, il y a un étranger là." So I had become the stranger. So yeah, the stranger is, of course, also a foreigner, or as Robert Heinlein put it in his 1961 novel, Stranger in a Strange Land, there's something, again, there's a homely side to this. Doubly so in that, first off, Heinlein had the idea for doing a version of Kipling's Jungle Book, but where the main character would be not raised by animals, but by Martians before coming to Earth. So it harked back to Kipling. That's the first reason. The second reason it's quite a homely idea is because, looking forward, this idea of the Martian coming to Earth has, of course, become one of the absolute staples of earthly culture, from either the Martian poetry school of Craig Raine, in which ordinary things look, as it were, identifiably strange. You know, you'll remember some of the great bits of Martian poetry where, you know, you'll remember that, dogs piss like hurdlers and shit like weightlifters. The strange is rendered familiar, and the familiar is rendered strange. And then there's the other the sort of ultimate example of this, David Bowie, late of this parish, who famously fell to earth in Nick Rogue's film of that name, is perhaps the ultimate example of the stranger no one on earth could fail to recognize. You know, there he is, he turns up, he shacks up with that woman, and you think, God, surely at some point she's going to realize not that he's a Martian, but that he's David Bowie. So to repeat, it's quite a cozy idea, this notion of the stranger. To say I'm a stranger here myself is to sort of wrap oneself to swaddle oneself in a much worn blanket that's grown rather soft with use. I'll change direction slightly now. And I want to go back to 1922 and quote D.H. Lawrence when he's in New Mexico, and he writes to E.M. Forster and says, I feel a great stranger, but have got used to that feeling and prefer it to feeling homely. After all, one is a stranger nowhere so hopelessly as at home. That was in 1922, but in 1925, 3 years later, he makes a crucial inversion. He says, one can no longer say, I'm a stranger everywhere, only everywhere I'm at home. Now, Lawrence is talking obviously about geography, about places, but it seems to me that this idea can usefully be extended to the notion of form. For any writer growing up, the novel is the home that we become accustomed to and familiar with. We're aware of its conventions and habits. And speaking personally for me, my book about D.H. Lawrence, Out of Sheer Rage, was an important step away from this cozy homeland of the novel without succumbing to any lingering symptoms of homesickness or nostalgia. It was a way, if you like, of being at home in the idea of literary estrangement. So the question becomes, I think, where can one make a home in writing? I mean, don't we want books that are strange? Well, in a sense, if you're a publisher, sort of definitely not. And as readers as well, we like to know where we stand. It's tempting in a way to judge books by how closely they resemble other books that we like. The less strange, the better. On an individual basis as well, I think the ideal is for a writer to keep coming up with different iterations, different versions of a previous book. You'd have thought the idea might have been to write something that gained recognition for the way that it didn't resemble anything else. To that extent, it was really gratifying for me when somebody in the NYRB wrote that I had produced one of the strangest bodies of work in contemporary letters. I persuaded myself that that was a compliment. I was dropped by my publisher after that was published. As a sidebar, I'd add as well that it's actually very common for highly derivative writers to be labelled as original. And that's no surprise, really, because their originality is recognised precisely because it's been seen and done before. That's what it means to recognise something. And so just as strange becomes ordinary, so that which is quite ordinary garners praise, a reputation for being strange. There's a story in my new book, it's the title story, it's called White Sands, and it's about picking up a hitchhiker. And, what happens in that story is we pick up this hitchhiker, we're all getting on really well, and then we see a sign saying, notice, do not pick up hitchhikers, detention facilities in area. And that changes everything. But it's a shame in a way because, I did a load of hitchhiking when I was younger. It's one of the great ways to meet other people. It's a great and very cheap way to travel. And because I did so much of it, my wife and I are really keen to get our round in now. We're always on the lookout for hitchhikers. There are virtually none. It's sort of, it's kind of died out, and that's a real shame, I think, because it really illustrates one of the great truths of travel, which is just how little we have to fear from strangers. I mean, it's just wonderful how few bad things happen at the hands of strangers. I mean, given the amazing inequalities of income in the world, when you're in some developing country, it's amazing to me not just that I don't get robbed the moment I leave my hotel, it amazes me that I don't get eaten. It's just extraordinary how honest and nice people are, irrespective of these terrible inequalities of income. And I think, I went to Sunday school for a very short time as a boy, and, going to the sort of Church of England Sunday school, I feel it was my first really, really deep immersion in the idea of boredom. It was all these biblical stories were so boring, but you know, there is no story in the Bible lovelier than that of the Good Samaritan, I think. And yeah, that is one of the lessons of travel, how little we have to fear from one another. Bob Dylan, in a song, famously says his sister should not treat him like a stranger. But actually, strangers are treated quite well all over the world. Generally speaking, most people have no more intention of harming you than you have of harming them. Although obviously at certain times, certain places, Fallujah and Grozny are best avoided. And I think that's one of the reasons why there was such an outcry when during the London riot, the riots in England in 2011, there was that poor boy from Malaysia. He was visiting England and he got punched in the face as he was cycling along, had his jaw broken, and that was sort of horrible enough. And then he was helped by two apparent good Samaritans, but actually they weren't helping him. They were helping themselves to the contents of his rucksack. And there was a huge outcry about this, and it was truly terrible, irrespective of how poor or disenfranchised the perpetrators were. We feel that if you're a stranger, if you're lost and powerless, you should be entitled actually to some extra degree of protection from your hosts. I think that's also a reminder of why that supposedly cool skateboarding or surfing idea of locals only is actually just about the least cool thing imaginable. Generally speaking, the only reason a place is for locals only is because it's such a shithole that no one else wants to go there. You know the scene. The stranger turns up at the tavern in Transylvania and asks for directions for Castle Dracula, whereupon a kind of terrible silence descends upon the saloon. And I always like those kind of films until that moment, but then I feel, you know, it'd be so much better if someone said, you know, oh, you don't want to go up there, Dracula, he's a ghastly old bore, stay the night here. And I would love to see a film in which he says, okay, I will, and then you could imagine, you know, he stays the night in this tavern, gets into a great sort of thing of drinking steins of beer, gets into a sort of sing-along, and, you know, wakes up in the morning with a thumping headache and just gets the stagecoach back to London. And that would be... and he has lovely memories of the sort of fantastic hospitality he's enjoyed in that part of the world. So... Anyway, the opposite of this idea of locals only, of treating strangers with great kindness, is beautifully, of course, expressed by Whitman in the Song of Myself, when the runaway slave comes to his house and Whitman goes outside, and I quote, and sat on a log and led him in and assured him and brought water and filled a tub for his sweated body and bruised feet and gave him a room that entered from my own and gave him some coarse, clean clothes and remember perfectly well his revolving eyes and his awkwardness, and remember putting plasters on the galls of his neck and ankles. He stayed with me a week before he was recuperated and passed north. I sat him next to me at my table, my firelock leaned in the corner. I think it's worth remembering that at that point in history, the slave was considered not just a stranger, but not human at all, merely a beast of burden. And I think perhaps one of the general drifts of our history over the past century and a half or so has been that we now see how much we have in common, not just with other humans, but with other actual animals. And of course, these animals, the idea doesn't seem strange to us now, but it turns out they were our ancestors. And of course we have Darwin to thank for this. And Sebastião Salgado, the photographer, describes what for me is the ultimate meeting with a stranger, when partly under the inspiration of Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, he visits the Galapagos, and there he sees a giant turtle, which he reminds us this creature can live up to 200 years. And to photograph it, he goes down on his knees to its level and looks into this turtle's eyes, and gradually the turtle becomes sort of used to him. And this is what Salgado, not the turtle, this is what he goes on to say about this encounter. He says, when you're in front of a creature of that age, you're facing real authority, with all those wrinkles, all that knowledge. When Darwin went there, that turtle would already have been an adult. Maybe it saw Darwin, who knows? So I love this idea that, in a sense, this strangest of creatures with whom we could hardly have less in common turns out not to be a stranger at all. He turns out to be a sort of acquaintance, almost a friend of a friend. It's like Salgado is saying, oh, you know, I sort of knew Charles Darwin, you know, and I've got an invitation card from him in the shape of the Voyage of the Beagle. Anyway, that's almost the image I want to leave you with, but actually the final thing that I want to remind you of is this wonderful sign that I saw in a camp at Burning Man, and it read very simply, "Strangers welcome. Stranger the better." Thank you very much.